Mid-February 1943. The desert wind howled outside a command post near the Tunisian border, carrying with it the sounds of celebration. Inside, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, sat in relative silence, penning a letter to his wife, Lucy. His forces had just achieved a spectacular tactical success, smashing through American positions at the Kasserine Pass. To the soldiers of the Afrika Korps outside, this was proof of German invincibility. But inside the bunker, Rommel was engaged in a cold, clinical analysis of his new enemy. The letter was blunt, stripped of any propaganda. Rommel wrote that the Americans were soft, lacked proper training, and their officers committed amateur mistakes that would have resulted in immediate court-martial in any respectable European army. Rommel had just watched American forces break, scatter, and run at Kasserine. It was a chaotic rout. Over 6,000 American casualties in 6 days. Entire battalions had surrendered en masse. Pristine equipment, barely used, lay abandoned across the burning sands. It was the kind of total psychological collapse Rommel had witnessed from the French in 1940, a sign of an army that had already lost the will to fight. To Rommel's experienced eye, the Americans were not just beaten, they were humiliated. These were soldiers who had grown up on the mythological stories of World War I heroism, yet here they were, suddenly questioning if they were cut out for the brutality of modern combat. Rommel didn't just see a tactical opening on a map, he believed he was witnessing the American spirit breaking in real time. He theorized to Lucy that the American soldier was psychologically fragile, unable to cope with the shock of blitzkrieg tactics. His conclusion was terrifyingly simple. If Germany could launch another massive offensive within weeks, they could push the Americans into the sea before they ever learned how to fight properly. This assessment was immediately shared with Berlin. The logic was undeniable. Exploit American weakness immediately. Strike while they are paralyzed by fear. Do not give them a single moment to breathe or adapt. Rommel's assessment wasn't based on arrogance or prejudice. It was based on cold, observed performance data. At Kasserine Pass, American forces had demonstrated a catalog of critical failures that stunned German observers. Their commanders positioned units poorly, leaving flanks exposed and high ground undefended. Radio discipline collapsed the moment the first shells fell, clogging the airwaves with panic rather than orders. Coordination between infantry and armor, the hallmark of modern warfare, was virtually non-existent. When German forces attacked, American units retreated without orders, creating a cascading panic that infected neighboring units. The root of the rot was at the top. The American II Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, had constructed his headquarters in a canyon 70 miles behind the front lines. He was trying to fight a war by telephone, completely detached from the visceral reality of the battlefield. His orders were confused, contradictory, and often arrived too late to matter. German intelligence officers compiled detailed reports on the phenomenon. They noted that while American equipment was adequate and individual soldiers fought bravely when cornered, the American command structure was amateurish. These were not soldiers who had faced the Wehrmacht before. They were learning the bloody business of warfare in real time against Germany's best veterans. Rommel calculated it would take the Americans at least 6 months to fix their leadership problems and probably 12 months to develop an effective combat doctrine. If Germany struck again in March, the result would inevitably be another Kasserine. German armored doctrine had proven itself against every opponent since the invasion of Poland in 1939. The formula was ruthless and efficient. Concentrate superior force at a specific weak point, the Times Schwerpunkt asterisk. Break through with armored spearheads. Exploit that breakthrough with fast-moving mobile formations to wreak havoc in the rear. Force the enemy to retreat in chaos or be encircled and annihilated. This doctrine had shattered the French armies in 6 weeks. It had destroyed vast Soviet armies in 1941. It had pushed British forces back and forth across North Africa twice. The formula worked because most armies fought defensively, trying to hold static lines that German mobility could simply bypass or puncture. Kasserine Pass had proven the Americans fought exactly the same way. They established fixed defensive positions and passively waited to be attacked. When German armor concentrated against weak sectors, American forces retreated rather than counterattack, surrendering the initiative. Rommel studied the terrain around El Ghoutar in central Tunisia. It was the perfect stage for another demonstration of German superiority. If German forces attacked there in late March, they would catch American units still psychologically recovering from the trauma of Kasserine. The psychological advantage alone would be decisive. Berlin approved Rommel's assessment without hesitation. One more offensive would break American morale completely. Then, Germany could shift its elite forces to face the British, while the Americans shipped their defeated, demoralized army home. However, German intelligence reports noted a command change in early March that seemed insignificant at the time. Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. had assumed command of 2nd Corps on the 6th of March 1943, the very same corps that had collapsed at Kasserine. When Patton arrived at headquarters, the atmosphere changed before he even spoke a word. He didn't just arrive, he invaded his own camp. He rolled in with a siren-blaring motorcade, dust kicking up around him, wearing his famous ivory-handled revolvers, like a cowboy gunfighter. He didn't just issue orders, he issued an ultimatum to every man in uniform. The days of the soft American were over. Patton forced men to wear ties and regulation helmets in the blistering desert heat. This wasn't out of vanity, it was a calculated psychological move. He needed to remind them that they were professionals, soldiers of a superpower, not defeated refugees running for their lives. Officers who arrived without proper uniform were fined heavily on the spot. Soldiers who didn't salute were reprimanded publicly. The German assessment was skeptical. One general couldn't fix systemic problems in 3 weeks. Patton might improve morale slightly or enforce better discipline, but he couldn't teach an entire corps new combat doctrine in less than a month. Rommel's health was failing rapidly. His stomach ailments and exhaustion were worsening, forcing him to leave Africa. But his tactical mind remained sharp. He reviewed the Algeta attack plan one final time before turning operational command over to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The plan assumed American defensive tactics would remain static. It assumed American hesitation under pressure. It assumed that 3 weeks wasn't enough time to transform an army. Every assumption was logical, based on German experience against every other opponent they had faced. The 22nd of March 1943. The tension in the desert air was palpable as German forces prepared to attack American positions near El Guitar. The German order of battle was formidable, including the battle-hardened 10th Panzer Division with their Mark IV tanks and the experienced Italian Centauro Division. German commanders briefed their units on the expected American responses, confident in their predictions. They believed Americans would defend from fixed, obvious positions. When German armor concentrated, the Americans would likely panic and call for air support that might not arrive in time. If pressure increased, the Americans would retreat, just as they had at Kasserine. The German tanks possessed superior firepower and armor protection. Their high-velocity 75mm guns could penetrate the frontal armor of an American Sherman tank at 2,000 yards. In contrast, the Sherman's short-barreled gun needed to close to suicidal ranges, often 500 yards or less, for effective penetration. This technical advantage in firepower was usually decisive in the open desert terrain. German artillery prepared detailed fire plans to suppress American positions and keep their heads down. The entire operation was designed to exploit exactly what had worked at Kasserine. It was to be a slaughter. The 23rd of March 1943, dawn broke over the jagged ridges of El Guitar. German forces advanced, engines roaring, expecting another easy victory. They were about to discover that 3 weeks was, in fact, enough time to change everything that mattered. The German attack began promptly at 6 a.m. Lead elements of the 10th Panzer Division rolled confidently toward American positions held by the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One. Visibility was good. The terrain was favorable for armor. Everything matched the operational plan perfectly. Then, the world exploded. American artillery opened fire. But this was not the scattered, hesitant firing of Kasserine. This was something entirely new. It was not ranging shots. It was not uncoordinated harassment. It was coordinated time-on-target salvos. This meant that American fire direction centers calculated the flight time of shells from dozens of different batteries, so that every shell landed on the German positions at the exact same split second. Every gun in I Corps could concentrate its fire on a single point simultaneously. This level of mathematical artillery coordination was something German forces, still relying heavily on horse-drawn logistics and traditional signaling, could not replicate. The accuracy was shocking. The volume was devastating. German tanks took direct hits, their armor cracking under the barrage. Radio operators heard urgent, screaming calls from infantry units, requesting medical evacuation as the ground around them churned into a moonscape. The Americans weren't suppressed. They were firing back with a precision that suggested professional forward observers and highly experienced artillery crews. Despite the shock, the 10th Panzer Division kept advancing. This was the Wehrmacht. They were used to resistance. They assumed the Americans would eventually break under sustained pressure. German commanders ordered units to push through the wall of artillery and close with American positions. Suddenly, American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed, hull-down positions. German Mark IVs started taking hits from the flanks. The Americans weren't defending from the obvious positions on the map. They had positioned anti-tank weapons to create deadly kill zones and crossfire that made German armor vulnerable regardless of which way they turned. By 9 a.m., German forces had penetrated 2,000 yards into American positions. In any other battle, this would signal the beginning of the end for the defenders. But the Americans weren't retreating. They were conducting fighting withdrawals to prepared secondary positions. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, El Guetar wasn't just a battle for territory, it was an exorcism of their past failures. They were the same soldiers who had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass, but something had shifted in their souls. As the 10th Panzer rolled toward them, the Big Red One didn't look for an exit, they looked at their sights. They had traded their fear for a cold, professional rage. German radio intercepts began to pick up American communication, and what they heard was disturbing. The tone was professional, calm, and deadly serious. Officers were giving clear tactical orders. Units were reporting positions and coordinating overlapping fields of fire. This wasn't the panicked, confused radio chatter from Kasserine Pass. American infantry held their positions under intense German fire until explicitly ordered to withdraw. When they did withdraw, they moved to new positions and immediately resumed fighting. They weren't running away. They were executing tactical retreats that preserved unit cohesion while making every yard of German advance prohibitively costly. On the German right flank, the Italian Centauro Division reported heavy resistance. American counterfire was pinning their infantry down completely. When Italian units attempted to advance, American machine gun positions opened fire from overlapping fields that created a wall of lead. The Americans had prepared the battlefield properly, anticipating the enemy's moves. By noon, the German advance had stalled completely at 3,000 yards. This wasn't the breakthrough Kasserine Pass had led German commanders to expect. It was a brick wall. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure, received reports from El Guetar at his headquarters with growing unease. The attack wasn't achieving its objectives. American resistance was organized, effective, and strangely fierce. Casualties were mounting rapidly without a corresponding collapse in the American lines. This didn't match the intelligence assessment at all. Von Arnim studied the tactical reports with growing concern. Something fundamental had changed in the equation. The Shermans were still technically outgunned by German armor. The terrain wasn't dramatically different from Kasserine, but the Americans were fighting with a level of coordination and aggression that German commanders hadn't anticipated. Radio intercepts revealed American officers giving confident tactical orders, calling down hellfire on specific coordinates. Artillery was concentrating fire with devastating precision. Infantry was counterattacking to retake lost ground instead of retreating further. This wasn't the demoralized force from 3 weeks earlier. This was an army that had found its backbone. March 24. Von Arnim made the difficult decision to recommend calling off the offensive. German casualties were significant, and they had achieved no breakthrough. The Americans were too strong in their current positions, and continuing the attack would only waste valuable armor. The attack was suspended, and German forces withdrew. German intelligence immediately went to work to understand what had happened at El Guetar. They interviewed captured American soldiers, they studied documents recovered from the battlefield. They desperately needed to know what had created this transformation. The Americans hadn't received secret new weapons, they hadn't received massive reinforcements, they hadn't trained for months in rear areas to learn new tactics. The change had happened in exactly 21 days under Patton's command. Patton's method was simple, brutal, but radical. First, he initiated a ruthless leadership purge. He fired officers who hesitated. He promoted men who attacked. Command positions went only to officers who understood that speed and aggression were the only things that won battles. Second, he forced a doctrine revolution. Every unit learned to counterattack immediately when attacked. Artillery was centralized to concentrate fire to achieve overwhelming effects at decisive points. Defense meant aggressive patrolling and spoiling attacks, never passive waiting. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he engineered a psychological transformation. Patton convinced his soldiers they were superior to their enemy, not through empty speeches, but through rigorous training that rewarded aggression and punished caution. Units that performed well received public recognition. Officers who failed were relieved immediately. The entire corps learned one singular lesson: attack succeeds, hesitation fails. German commanders were left to analyze what El Guetar revealed about the future of the war. The Americans had adopted a doctrine that effectively neutralized German tactical advantages. German doctrine relied on concentrated armor breaking through weak points. American doctrine responded with mobile anti-tank weapons positioned to create crossfire, turning the breakthrough into a trap. German advances became costly regardless of their armor superiority. German doctrine assumed defenders would retreat under sustained pressure. American doctrine now taught immediate counterattacks that disrupted German momentum before it could build. What looked like a sure victory suddenly became a desperate fight for survival. German doctrine emphasized technical superiority and individual tactical excellence. American doctrine emphasized coordination and overwhelming industrial-scale firepower. The Germans prided themselves on the individual skill of the panzer commander. The Americans countered with the industrial might of time-on-target artillery strikes. It was a mechanical symphony of violence. For the German infantryman, it felt like the sky itself was falling. They weren't fighting individual soldiers anymore. They were fighting a coordinated, lethal machine that had finally found its rhythm. The Americans weren't trying to match German technical advantages tank for tank. They were making those technical advantages irrelevant through superior coordination and volume of fire. Rommel had written revised assessments before leaving Tunisia, sensing the shift. The Americans had learned faster than any opponent Germany had faced. They had identified their weaknesses at Kasserine and fixed them in 3 weeks. The sleeping giant was awake, and it was angry. Any future offensive against American forces would require significantly more resources, different tactics, and the grim realization that the easy victories were gone forever.